Thank you all for being here. One, regular business, the approval of the January 8th agenda. And
Second.
and Kelly, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carried. Approval of the December 11th minutes.
So move.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Director's report.
Have a planning walkable places update. Tricia?
Shot at this kid. This is accept.
They're like, it says director.
Don't have too much of an update, just want to draw your attention to our quarterly written update that's in your packet. There's just a list of all the planning walkable places plans that were awarded and the status of each one, where they're at in terms of getting done. And also wanted to let you know that we're planning to have kind of a project fair at one of your upcoming meetings this spring, so you can learn more about where things are at with all these different projects.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay.
She needs to stay up there for the
Okay.
the TIP project
Keep right
reporting.
on rolling there, Chris.
Okay, thank you. The next thing we wanted to bring to your attention is this document. It's in your packet. It's called the Project Status Report. We're excited to get this put together for the first time. You'll probably remember you approved our Transportation Improvement Program at your meeting a couple meetings ago. And this document goes through each project that's in the TIP and summarizes where things are at with the project. Here's an example sheet that's in there in terms of whether it's right in the beginning of the project development process in terms of doing refinement studies and preliminary engineering, or if it's further along, closer to construction. So we hope that you find this helpful and are definitely glad to, if you have any comments or like to see any particular information on that, please let us know. This is our first run with this, and definitely want to be responsive to the sorts of information you'd like to see in something like this.
I like the new format.
Yes.
It's really easy to read and follow, so I think it'll be real helpful as projects change and move through the process, so thank you.
Well, definitely we'll pass along those thanks to my colleague, Tricia Thomas. We can thank her for the great layout and the ease of reading.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
One more item on the year-end balance. As you know, we have the last couple, 3 years have had a pretty significant balance of year-end funds from STP funds. And I've asked Kristen to kind of put together a small report for how much is available this year or so far. And what we're trying to do is give you a more up-to-date balance over the course of the year rather than wait till the last couple, 3 months and then have to scramble for projects. So what we're trying to do is maybe put together some idea of how it might fit into a different type of bucket approach to where there are different types of projects available that will kind of expand the eligibility for those funds. But I think Kristen has the total that's available now, and we want to keep giving you those on a periodic basis so you'll know what you could be dealing with in terms of what types of projects and how much money is available. So.
Thanks a lot, Phil. Our current estimated balance for this federal fiscal year, which is 2019, is negative $65,000. So that's where we stand as of January 2nd, just about a week ago. Don't freak out that it's negative. There's a couple of things going on. The first one is KDOT has used a pretty conservative amount for our 2019 annual allocation that we'll be getting this year. It's roughly 3% less than what we would expect to get, and that translates to about $390,000. They will continue to use this conservative estimate up until probably later this spring when they will get a final number from the feds. So we're hoping that we can use this conservative estimate for our amount we're getting this year to just kind of keep everybody safe until we get the final number from the feds this spring. If we were to use the amount that we would generally expect to see and not this conservative number, our balance would be $325,000 due to some deobligations that have occurred to date. So that's where we stand with our estimate of our projected end of the year balance.
I think as you recall, the last couple of years, we've had between $2.5 and $3 million in available unobligated monies at the end of the year. The year before last, we did Planning Walkable Places program, and this last year, we funded a bridge on South Meridian and a ITS project that will kind of help to improve the signalization areas. We'd like to come to you next month with an idea of maybe the bucket type approach of having different funds available and different projects available in those areas. So we're hoping to get that to you next month. So.
Do you have any idea what the different buckets that you're going to have at this point, or is that still to be determined?
Well, right now we were looking at projects like continuation of preservation of arterial roads and bridges. There might be something because we're going to have the huge increase in the freight, in the frequency of loads and the amount of trucks, the freight preparation projects to upgrade to make sure that we have the capacity and the design to accommodate 80,000-pound trucks. Safety aspects on those, active projects like hike and bike trails, different things like that would give you more flexibility in trying to fund projects and get them in before the end of the year. We just don't want to take a chance on losing that money.
Right. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, moving on. Public comment. Anybody from the public that'd like to address the board? If not, new business, workshop. Chris, what's this?
Thank you. So, Chris Upchurch, Principal Planner for WAMPO. I've talked to you quite a bit last year about sort of the process for updating our metropolitan transportation plan. That's our long-range vision for the future of transportation in the Wichita region. And I'm happy to say that after talking a bunch about process last year, we are actually underway with that. We have been going out and talking to many of the city councils, many other stakeholder groups, members of the public over the past month. We'll be continuing that through January and into February, trying to gather our initial public input that we will use to create the high-level vision and goals for this plan. And today I'm here to talk to you guys, because the policy body is certainly one of our most important stakeholders, to get your input on what's going to go into the vision and goals. And then in turn, you'll have the opportunity to actually decide on and adopt the vision and goals, probably at your March meeting. But always want to get your input on the front end here. So that's what I'm here to do today. Hopefully we don't have to do the what is WAMPO question at this meeting. But our metropolitan transportation plan really is that high-level vision. We're looking out over the next 20 years, all of the transportation spending in the Wichita region, which is going to be billions of dollars. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about where we are now, the current state of our system. Talk about what the future might look like, where we see the possibilities of our transportation system going. And finally, ask you guys what you think we need to consider. Get input from you on what should be going into the long-range plan and specifically into the vision and goals. So start out by talking about where we are now. I always like to start out talking about safety. That's one of our most important aspects of our system. And unfortunately, we do not have great news there. Our fatalities have been trending up since about the beginning of the decade, slowly rising. For serious injury accidents, we have been seeing a better trend. Those have been declining over the past decade. but for non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries, so fatalities and serious injuries among bicyclists and pedestrians, those have been ticking up for the past couple of years. So 2 of our 3 major safety statistics are moving in the wrong direction. Talk a little about congestion. This is an area where we do pretty well here in Wichita. We say that based on our model, the average rush hour trip in the afternoon rush hour only has about 26 seconds added to it due to congestion. And for comparison, the average trip is about 10 minutes long. So maybe 5% of the trip length is congestion. We do anticipate that in the future that's going to rise. It'll probably be up to about 45 seconds by 2040. So doing pretty good overall in terms of congestion. What if we look at particularly bad times? What about the worst weekday of the month? If we look at that, it takes about 50% longer for that trip. So the worst weekday of the month, the day where you have an accident or a weather event or something like that, we're looking at about that, an extra 5 minutes tacked onto that 10-minute trip. Not great, but certainly not horrible compared to some other places. And finally, what about bottlenecks? What about these areas where we've identified that may be potential bottleneck areas? Well, for the freeways, we're looking at about 5 to 13% longer to traverse those bottlenecks. For interchanges where we have a little bit more of a problem, that goes up to about 19%. And that 19% specifically is the North Junction, which I don't think comes as a surprise to anyone on this board. That is clearly the most significant bottleneck in our region. So overall, we're doing pretty good. We've got quite a bit of capacity for future growth, but there certainly are some localized areas, some spot improvements that we could address. Can't talk about transportation without talking about money. So based on our current long-range plan, Move 2040, we projected there will be about $6 billion in transportation spending between 2015 and 2040. And the way that breaks down, about $600 million of that is federal transportation spending through WAMPO. About $2 billion is spending by KDOT, and that's a mix of KDOT state funds and the federal funds that KDOT receives. And finally, the majority of this is actually being spent by our local member jurisdictions, about $3.6 billion. So that's the biggest single share of our transportation spending. Now, there is a lot of uncertainty out there on the funding side. The current federal transportation legislation expires in 2020. We're not expecting any big infusions of federal funds in the future. I think that'll probably be pretty flat. KDOT has issues. The state legislature has transferred significant amounts of funding out of the KDOT budget to patch holes elsewhere in the state budget. And we're really seeing that has had a significant impact on KDOT's ability to deliver projects in our region. And then there's the matter of, is what we are spending now adequate? Is that $6 billion over 25 years doing what we want to do? And if we want to maintain current conditions, signs are it may not be. When KDOT has set their targets for pavement and bridge condition, they've said that they indicated they expect the conditions to get worse than they are now. And the city of Wichita, with respect to the pavement condition, has explicitly talked about managing the decline of their system. They can't maintain the current level of condition with their current level of spending. Air quality is another area where we've got some good news. We are currently doing better than the EPA standard by a fair bit, and we're not in any immediate danger of getting designated as a non-attainment area, at least not unless our air quality either gets worse or the standard is made stricter. So we're doing pretty well there. Talk a little about the demographics of our region. We are a very slow-growing area, less than 1% per year. We have an aging population. And in particular, what we're seeing is as the baby boom generation gets into retirement, more of them are staying in the Wichita area rather than moving off to Florida or Arizona to retire, the way previous generations might have. And that's really increasing the numbers of seniors in our region. On the flip side, we're seeing the millennials and Generation Z coming into adulthood and entering the workforce. Unfortunately, we tend to be losing the most educated fraction of these folks. As President Bardo of Wichita State University likes to say, Wichita's #1 export is airplanes, our #2 export is educated young people, and that's a problem for us economically. The upshot of both of these trends is an increase in the number of single-person and childless households. On one end, you have empty nesters as the baby boom generation ages and becomes seniors. On the other end, these millennials and Generation Z folks tend to be taking longer to get married and to have kids. So fewer sort of traditional multi-person families, more 1 or 2 person households. About a third of our population is minority and about 15% is low income. Now, one of the trends we're looking at in terms of land use is those demographics are having an impact on people's desire for how they want to live. If you are a 1 or 2 person household, maybe the traditional single family house out in the suburbs isn't as appealing. We're seeing more demands for multifamily housing, apartments and duplexes, that sort of thing. And that creates denser land use based on those changing demographics, which have opportunities for more transit use, more walkability, and more bike ped facilities. Also big impacts on public health. One of the best things you can do for your health is to move to a more walkable neighborhood. Talk a little about our airport. This is a big asset for the region, and it's one where we have a lot of capacity to increase both passenger and cargo traffic. Speaking of cargo, we have about $48 billion of freight moving through the WAMPO region in total, and we're projecting that's going to increase significantly. And in particular, and the reason we have the big brown truck on this slide, is we're looking at a big increase in last mile freight, so deliveries to individual homes and businesses. Talk a little about technology. We have been investing in that a fair bit in the Wichita region. We have our Whichway Traffic Operations Center. If you have any questions, ask Tom Hine. And that has really had a big impact on our region, particularly on accident clearance times. We've cut the amount of time it takes to clear an accident on our freeway system by about 2/3 since Whichway came into operation. But that said, there are even more dramatic changes on the horizon. Things like connected and autonomous vehicles, trends even unrelated to transportation are going to have a big impact, like more people working remotely. Each remote worker takes a commuter trip during rush hour off the road. So big impacts coming on the horizon in technology. So speaking of the horizon, what sort of futures are we looking at? You guys have heard before about our scenario planning effort and heard about these scenarios, so I'm not going to belabor them too much, but I did want to review them. Just as a reminder, these are not really trying to predict one future, but multiple possibilities. They're tools to help get us thinking about what sorts of future we might have, what we might want to take account of in this next long-range plan. They're based on the trends that we've been talking about here and elsewhere for quite a bit. They really each take a trend sort of to its logical conclusion. So our baseline scenario is that the next 10 or 20 years will look a lot like the past 5 or 10. Big emphasis in this scenario on maintaining what we have. We think we would build about the same mix of projects, see about the same number of KDOT projects come into our region. And in a way, this is the least likely scenario. One thing we're sure of is that the future is going to change. But this is sort of a basis for comparison. Getting into the more speculative scenario, our first one is really based on those demographic and land use trends, that this graying population, the more millennials and Gen Z folks, more childless and single-person households lead to a desire for more urban living, alternative transportation modes. And in this sort of future, we're looking at denser land use, more development in the downtown core, even denser land uses coming in some of our outlying cities as they develop into more town centers versus your classic suburban development. Big impact of walkability and big use of transit in this scenario. This is a very transit-friendly future. Second scenario is based on the financial shortfalls that I talked about, that we would continue to see and see more of a shortfall in state and federal transportation funding. In this scenario, we're assuming that there is strong regional leadership and we're able to come up with local transportation funds to help fill that gap. So to prepare for a future like this, we need to cultivate regional leadership and regional identity. We need to think about new local transportation funding sources and have a big emphasis on freight, since we would be depending on our local economy to really drive that transportation funding. Of course, the flip side of this is if we have these shortfalls but don't make the local investments, then we're going to have to do less with less. We're not going to be able to build as many transportation projects. We are in a better position for this sort of future than a lot of other places are, as we do have quite a bit of capacity and we are not growing super fast. We're not trying to build our way out of a problem the way some faster growing places are. In this sort of future, we would have some very hard decisions, prioritizing limited resources. We might want to think about stopping maintaining some facilities, maybe repurposing some underutilized lane miles as bike ped facilities, for instance. And maybe rethinking some of our land use decisions when we can no longer spend money to build new transportation options for developments that get built. Maybe we need to start thinking about siting those developments based on existing transportation infrastructure. And finally, our last scenario is based around technology. Things like automated vehicles, cars that drive themselves, remote work, as I mentioned earlier. And for this sort of scenario, we would want to emphasize the shift to mobility services, services like Lyft and Uber rather than individual car ownership. This is the very challenging scenario for traditional transit. We think that these self-driving cars would take a lot of the niche that's filled by transit right now. Probably be building fewer traditional roadway projects, less concrete and asphalt, but more investment in technology. We'd be buying more fiber optics and electronics for our transportation system. And this is probably the most uncertain future, so a big emphasis on flexibility. So I've talked a little bit about where we are now, about what the future might look like. Now we come to the interactive portion of this program, is we want to hear from you about what we think we need to consider. So what I'd like to do is have the policy body get together in some smaller groups, say everyone from Commissioner or Councilmember Claycomb over on this end, and maybe everyone down to Ann on this end, and then the folks of you down at the end. Get together in a small group and we'll spend about 10-15 minutes to talk about these possible futures. And I think we have some prompts in the packet for you guys to take a look at, some questions on what you think we need to consider, what the most important priorities are for the next 20 years, what should the transportation system of the future look like. Talk about amongst yourselves about these questions, and then in 10 or 15 minutes we can convene back as a group and have each of these smaller groups talk about what conclusions you came to, what you think we need to be considering in the long range plan. All right, why don't we have each of the groups sort of have one of your members summarize what you discussed, what you think the answers to these questions are. Why don't we get started with the group over here on your right, or excuse me, your left, my right. Can we get a volunteer from that group to summarize?
Okay.
Or get someone volunteered?
Yeah. We talked about things that we need to consider in terms of as we grow our workforce, as we hope we grow our workforce, what things that we need to accommodate that. So, you know, when you look at it, if you look at the future of this region, if we don't accommodate the businesses that want to grow their workforces, then probably we don't need to worry about other things because we're going to, you know, those businesses won't want to be here. So we talked about things in terms of what priorities would be. So we talked about different types of transit. So we talked about a little bit about passenger rail. We talked about public transit buses. We talked about facilities for bicycles and scooters and walking, that those become important, particularly as we see a more dense core in our downtown, and how even if people live downtown, they still want to they may want to get to other areas in the region, but they may not want to have a car to do that. And so how do we help accommodate that? We talked about where's the region doing a good job. We decided in terms of just our lack of congestion. That's something that we do really well. We saw the numbers, right? And that needs to continue. Even as we grow, we would want to make sure that we are aware of that and watch for those bottlenecks and address those before they become a problem. And we talked about that maybe we're pretty good at doing that, but we would need to continue to be good at that, to really address those bottlenecks. We also talked about this, where should we cut back? One of the things we talked about there was one of the scenarios that we have is repurposing areas. And so as land use changes, and for example, if we have an area that becomes more freight heavy, for example, like one of the examples we talked about, like down at 47th and 235, we're seeing a lot more industrial going in there. So we need to think about that area needs to be accommodating for that freight. But we have other places in the city and in the region that maybe they used to be to serve some purpose, and now they could be repurposed. One of the things, Chris, I told him about George Washington Boulevard, that we talked about that in scenario planning. George Washington Boulevard used to be a really important way that people got to Boeing. But now, even with Spirit having almost, the workforce that Boeing had, that's not a major way that people get to Spirit. That's not where people live anymore. So thinking about that repurposing of things. Did I miss anything, guys? Thank you.
Okay, let's think.
All right, next group.
We were, what do you think that we need to consider? We were a little more specific on some issues. The overpass, 47th and K15 area, with the amount of traffic and the bottleneck potential there because of the railroad, looking at, type of a bypass, train traffic, public safety, and that sort of thing, for helping the area grow. A southwest loop, Clearwater, Derby, back up to Fort Summer, because there's no good way with the airport expansion going on out there for that area of the county to grow. Public transportation, because of what we're talking about down in the core area and whatnot, being able to accommodate the growth there and the changing demographics of the folks. We really think the east-west needs to be completed, because there's not a good way without, even when we finish East Kellogg, and then you're getting a bottleneck at 143rd County Line, another, that area. Then you go this way, you've got the stoplights on the west edge of Kellogg. So that needs to be, so just like the north-south corridor, you can go all the way through town without having a problem. So we think that needs to be fixed. Priorities, expanded rail for goods and people. We think that is critical for the growth of the area. Freight movement, and I think we've already went over that. Let's see, more freight. With more freight coming in, of course, what's our most important priorities? Yeah, the freight movement. We kept coming back to that, along with the age demographics. How are we going to move as our population gets older and people get rid of cars? How are we going to address that? So some of our assets, we think we have good teams of people working on transportation issues. Funding, we think we somehow or another have got to find some additional funding, either through the legislature along with that. Yeah. Bottom line is, is if, what we need to improve, if we don't keep up with the improvements and then we're going to lose the people we have. We have companies that are being, discussed moving to other communities on a daily basis. If we don't keep our transportation and highway and rail system up to where it's good for the businesses to be here, they're going to look elsewhere. So we have to keep that in mind. And cutbacks, we really looked at more like say it is not so much cutbacks, but maybe are we appropriating the money in the proper place? Do we really need to rethink where it's going? Just go from there. So that about sum it up, folks? Okay.
All right, third group.
All right, we didn't talk really about each specific question, but we kind of talked in generalities. We cannot build our way out of the situation. We're going to really have to rely on technology to solve the problem. We talked some about the traffic signal coordination on K-15 to keep the traffic moving all the way along that corridor. With the census coming up in 2020, we really need to utilize the data that's coming from that, and any involvement that we can do with the census would be great. We talked to some about coordination between the county and cities, making sure projects are discussed, and really making sure that everybody knows what the other's doing to kind of help. Talked kind of piggybacking on what Dan had said at the end, supporting regional projects and maybe reallocating funding. We did quite a bit of money on planning walkable places and the bridge project. Can we spend some of that money supporting other regional projects such as the Amtrak coming in? There's projected $1 million-ish shortfall on that. If WAMPO can help maybe support that, not sure if it's possible with funding restrictions, but something to look at. I think, was there anything else that you guys thought about? Data sharing.
Thank you.
Pete reminded me that the one other thing that we wanted to put on what we can do less is eliminating workshops.
Well, we can bring this one to an end at least. Any last minute thoughts that this inspired among anyone that you'd like us to capture?
Just want to say, we did talk about technology also. I forgot about that one, and how that's going to be, we think, become even much more important, like you guys say, that, with autonomous cars and potentially autonomous trucks, and how we build that technology into our infrastructure to handle that technology.
Might add that when we were talking about the census, does anybody know, like, as the census covers a lot of stuff, we think it'll be a lot more accurate than 10 years ago, just because of technology, probably in the census world. But do they ask questions like how many cars do you own, or autonomous, or we know we get aging and things like that, but I don't know if it.
Have in the
So
past.
I don't know that they have anything specifically on autonomous vehicles, but questions like how many cars that you own, those got moved about 10 years ago from the main census to the American Community Survey. So it used to be, if you may remember, when you did the census every 10 years, you could either get the short form or the long form, and about like 1/6 of the people got the long form. So in 2010, they got rid of the long form version of the census, but instead every year the census is going out and asking a smaller subset of people, essentially those same long form questions. That's what's called the American Community Survey. And that the idea is, rather than burdening a big chunk of people every 10 years, they slice it up and do that every year. So that's really where we get that information, and it sort of becomes available on an ongoing basis rather than in one big chunk every 10 years.
We think that's, we talked about that acronym, but we're not sure how accurate it is because of, do you want to mention something?
Typically, on average, they have like 1 in 8 households respond to the census, but maybe I don't want to have 20 for the 18
I haven't really looked at what response rates are here locally.
I'd like to expand on something that David had said, and we've talked about it in other meetings too, is when we were talking about east-west, we were talking about expanding that past what Dan had said and take a turnpike or a interstate from like Springfield to Lahaina or Colorado Springs. So you have an east-west through here and not just north-south. That didn't get on there, but that was part of it.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right, committee updates. Our executive committee, we met, the bucket topic issues, one of them we discussed about coming back, discussed earlier. We're also the IT, we're going to be going with Sedgwick County on their IT, moving from city.
City.
Right.
That was our other major topic. Discussion. Really the two main things we discussed, unless you guys, anybody else have any to add? Okay. TAC, Tom?
Don't have anything to report.
Tom, looks like you get to do 3.
Don't have much to report, other than we will open bids for the I-235 Green project next week. I believe it's January 16th, I believe, and construction is scheduled to start March 11, if the contractor's ready.
Thank you. All right. There any other business come before the board? If not, we stand adjourned.